Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of American history, where the line between the living and the dead becomes terrifyingly blurred. I'm your host, and this is a place where forgotten stories emerge from the shadows, where archive dust reveals truths that were meant to stay buried forever. Before we descend into tonight's investigation, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it in your part of the world? Drop a comment below telling us your location and the hour. There's something uniquely unsettling about sharing these stories across different time zones, knowing that somewhere it's the dead of night and somewhere else the sun is shining on secrets that prefer darkness. Today's case takes us to 1923, to the frozen heart of Montana, to a mining town called Hollow Ridge. If you search for it on modern maps, you'll find nothing. The town exists now only in faded county records, in yellowed newspapers archived in basement collections, in the fragmented memories of those few descendants who still carry the weight of what happened there. Hollow Ridge was built on copper and desperation, a settlement that clung to the mountainside like a wound that refused to heal. 300 souls called it home. By 1925, fewer than 50 remained. What drove them away wasn't economic collapse, it wasn't a mine disaster. It was something far more intimate, far more violating. It was the discovery that death itself had been corrupted in Hollow Ridge, that the boundary between respectful burial and unspeakable desecration had been crossed so many times that the earth itself seemed to reject what lay beneath it. On February 14, 1923, Valentine's Day, the town's gravedigger, Anthony Brennan, made a discovery that would unravel everything. Anthony was 47 years old, a widower who had buried his own wife 3 years prior in the very cemetery he maintained. He was a man who understood grief, who treated every grave with the solemnity of personal loss. That morning, as he prepared a new plot in the frozen ground, his shovel struck something unexpected. The adjacent grave, supposedly 6 months old, had shifted during the harsh winter frost heaves. Standard procedure required him to inspect and repair any structural damage to neighboring plots. What Anthony found when he carefully excavated the compromised grave would haunt him until his death in 1947. The coffin of Ellen Mitchell, buried in August 1922, had partially collapsed, but it was what lay inside that defied every natural law Anthony understood about death and decay. Ellen Mitchell's body was perfectly preserved, not mummified, not frozen, preserved as if she had died mere hours ago, her skin still retaining a pale flush, her features serene and unchanged, her dress remained pristine. Her hands, folded across her chest, showed no signs of the typical post-mortem changes that should have occurred within days, let alone months. Anthony, despite his years of experience with the dead, stumbled backward and vomited into the snow. He ran directly to Sheriff William Carter's office, barely coherent, his words tumbling over each other. The sheriff, a practical man who had seen his share of death in the Great War, initially dismissed it as a gravedigger's overactive imagination, perhaps influenced by bootleg whiskey. But Anthony Brennan was known throughout Hollow Ridge as a sober, reliable man. His distress was genuine, his terror palpable. By noon, Sheriff Carter, Dr. Henry Moss, and 2 deputies stood at the edge of Ellen Mitchell's opened grave, staring down at an impossibility. Dr. Moss, who had signed Ellen's death certificate 6 months earlier, who had witnessed her burial, knelt in the snow and examined what he could see without disturbing the body further. His hands trembled as he took notes. His medical training offered no explanation for what lay before him. "This shouldn't be possible," he whispered. "Not in this climate, not after 6 months, not without intervention." That single word, intervention, would become the key that unlocked a horror far deeper than anyone in Hollow Ridge could have imagined, because Ellen Mitchell wasn't the only one. Before the week ended, they would discover that her husband Gerald, buried 2 weeks before her, remained equally preserved, and their daughter, 9-year-old Michelle, who had died first in that terrible August of 1922, lay in her small coffin as if merely sleeping, her favorite doll still clutched in her unchanged hands. 3 bodies, 1 family, all perfectly preserved in defiance of nature itself. And in the town of Hollow Ridge, Montana, someone knew exactly why. To understand what happened in Hollow Ridge, we must first understand the world that created it. The year 1923 sat at a peculiar crossroads in American history. The Great War had ended 5 years earlier, leaving behind a generation of men who had seen mechanized death on an industrial scale. Prohibition had been law for 3 years, driving alcohol underground and creating a shadow economy that reached even the most remote corners of the nation. The Roaring Twenties were beginning in the cities, but in places like Hollow Ridge, life moved to an older, harsher rhythm. Montana itself was still wild country. Statehood had come only in 1889, and vast stretches remained unmapped, unnamed, untamed. Hollow Ridge had been established in 1897 when copper deposits were discovered in the Bitterroot Range foothills. The mine, owned by the Cascade Minerals Company based in Chicago, brought workers from across the country and across the Atlantic. Irish, Italian, Polish, and Norwegian immigrants mixed with American-born miners, creating a linguistic patchwork held together by the universal language of hard labor and harder winters. The town itself clung to the mountainside at an elevation of 6,200 feet. Winters routinely saw temperatures plunge to 30 degrees. Below zero, snow could accumulate to depths of 15 feet, cutting Hollow Ridge off from the outside world for weeks or even months at a time. The nearest town of any size, Helena, lay 90 miles to the east, along roads that became impassable from November through March. This isolation created a tight-knit community, but it also bred secrets. What happened in Hollow Ridge stayed in Hollow Ridge, buried under snow and silence. According to the 1920 census, which survives in the Montana Historical Society archives, Hollow Ridge numbered 287 residents. The town consisted of 1 main street with a general store, a doctor's office, a sheriff's station, a boarding house, a small Catholic church, and, crucially, a funeral home operated by Richard Crane. Surrounding this central hub were miners' cottages, most of them identical wooden structures provided by the mining company, heated by coal stoves, lit by kerosene lamps. Running water was a luxury few enjoyed. Life was brutal, and death was commonplace. The Mitchell family arrived in Hollow Ridge in the spring of 1919. Gerald Mitchell, 34 at the time, came from Pennsylvania seeking a fresh start after the war. He had served in France, seen things he wouldn't speak about, and returned home to find his previous life as a railroad clerk impossibly small. Montana represented opportunity, space, escape. His wife, Ellen, 28, was described in a letter preserved by her sister as fragile but determined. She had survived the Spanish flu pandemic that killed millions worldwide, but it had left her with persistent respiratory weakness. Their daughter Michelle was 5 years old when they arrived, a bright child who, according to the Hollow Ridge Elementary School records, showed particular talent in drawing and music. The teacher, Miss Sarah Pemberton, wrote in her 1921 report that Michelle possesses an unusual sensitivity to beauty, often sketching flowers and birds with remarkable detail for one so young. These records, now housed in the University of Montana archives, provide one of the few intimate glimpses into the Mitchell family before tragedy struck. Gerald found work in the mine, operating one of the ore lifts. It was dangerous work, but it paid $35 a week, enough to rent one of the company cottages and provide for his family. Ellen took in laundry and did seamstress work, her delicate fingers proving skilled with needle and thread. By all accounts, they were a quiet, respectable family, neither wealthy nor destitute, neither prominent nor forgotten. They attended Sunday Mass at St. Catherine's, paid their rent on time, and kept largely to themselves. But in a town as small as Hollow Ridge, everyone eventually needed the services of Richard Crane. Crane had arrived in Hollow Ridge in 1904, one of the town's earliest permanent residents. He was in his mid-30s then, and by 1923 he had become an institution. He served as undertaker, embalmer, and informal town historian. His funeral home, a two-story structure on the edge of town, also housed the only morgue within 90 miles. When miners died in cave-ins, when children succumbed to scarlet fever, when old-timers finally surrendered to the mountain's harsh demands, Richard Crane received them all. Contemporary descriptions paint him as an unremarkable man, medium height, thin build, with prematurely grey hair and unusually pale blue eyes. The Hollow Ridge Gazette, a weekly newspaper that published from 1898 to 1924, mentioned him occasionally in its social notes. Mr. Richard Crane attended the Independence Day celebration, as always dressed impeccably despite the summer heat. Mr. Crane donated $5 to the church roof repair fund, his customary generosity. He was respected, if not particularly liked. People found him cold, clinical, but acknowledged his professionalism. What no one knew, what would only emerge later through the careful excavation of his personal effects, was that Richard Crane had been conducting experiments for nearly 2 decades. Experiments in preservation, experiments in defeating decay, experiments that required fresh subjects and absolute privacy. The isolation of Hollow Ridge provided both. The harsh winters explained any delays in burial. The frozen ground meant graves often couldn't be dug for weeks after death, giving Crane extended access to bodies in his morgue. The community's trust meant no one questioned his methods. And the desperate grief of families like the Mitchells, facing multiple deaths in rapid succession, meant no one looked too closely at the details of his work. In August 1922, tragedy struck the Mitchell family with brutal efficiency. Michelle fell ill first, a sudden fever that Dr. Moss diagnosed as meningitis. She died within 3 days. Ellen, already weakened from her lingering respiratory issues and now devastated by grief, collapsed 2 weeks later. "Pneumonia," said Dr. Moss, though privately. He noted in his medical journal that her decline seemed almost willful, as if she had simply decided to follow her daughter. Gerald, broken by the loss of his wife and child, began drinking heavily. On August 30th, he was found dead in his cottage. The official cause was determined to be heart failure, though the empty bottle of bootleg whiskey beside him suggested a more complex truth. 3 deaths in 1 month. 1 family erased from existence. Richard Crane prepared all 3 bodies, conducted all 3 funerals, oversaw all 3 burials in the Hollow Ridge Cemetery, and 6 months later, when Anthony Brennan's shovel broke through frozen earth, the truth began its terrible emergence. The discovery of Ellen Mitchell's preserved body sent shockwaves through Hollow Ridge that no amount of snow could muffle. Sheriff Carter, understanding the potential for panic, initially tried to contain the information. He swore Anthony Brennan, Dr. Moss, and the 2 deputies to secrecy. But secrets in a town of 287 people have the lifespan of morning frost in sunlight. By evening, whispers circulated through the general store, the boarding house, the mine shaft tunnels. By the following morning, a crowd had gathered at the cemetery gates. Dr. Moss spent the night of February 14th in his office, surrounded by medical texts, searching for any natural explanation. Mummification required specific conditions, extreme dryness or extreme cold, and even then, the process was gradual. Recognizable, adipocere formation, the soap-like substance that sometimes preserved bodies in wet environments, had a distinct appearance and texture. What he had witnessed in Ellen Mitchell's coffin matched neither. Her preservation was perfect, as if time itself had been suspended the moment of her death. On February 15th, Sheriff Carter made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He authorized the exhumation of Gerald Mitchell's grave. If one body remained inexplicably preserved, it could perhaps be dismissed as a bizarre natural anomaly, but two bodies from the same family, that suggested something far more sinister. The exhumation began at dawn, with only Sheriff Carter, Dr. Moss, Anthony Brennan, and Father Michael O'Brien from St. Catherine's Church present. The priest insisted on attending, arguing that if graves were being disturbed, the church must bear witness. What they found silenced even Father O'Brien's habitual prayers. Gerald Mitchell lay in his coffin exactly as he had been placed 6 months earlier. His face showed no signs of decomposition. His hands, visible above the coffin lining, displayed no discoloration, no shrinkage, no mottling. The suit he wore remained crisp, unwrinkled. Even the flowers placed on his chest, which should have long since dried and crumbled, retained a ghostly semblance of their original form, as if preserved in some invisible amber. Dr. Moss's hands shook so violently he could barely write in his notebook. "This defies every principle of pathology I know," he told Sheriff Carter. "Bodies don't simply stop decaying. Decomposition is a biological certainty, as inevitable as gravity. Yet here we have two individuals who appear to have been removed from the natural order entirely." Father O'Brien made the sign of the cross and suggested they were witnessing either a miracle or a blasphemy. Sheriff Carter, a practical man even in the face of the impossible, focused on the only question that mattered. How? The answer, when it came, was worse than any of them could have imagined. That afternoon, working methodically through his growing dread, Sheriff Carter began investigating Richard Crane. He started with the funeral home records, publicly accessible documents that detailed every burial Crane had conducted since 1904. What Carter discovered was a pattern that, once seen, became impossible to ignore. Beginning in 1907, approximately 3 years after Crane's arrival in Hollow Ridge, a small percentage of the deceased showed unusual preservation characteristics in the days between death and burial. These notations were buried in technical language: minimal visible decomposition, extended preparation time required, specialized embalming techniques applied. The frequency increased over the years. By 1920, nearly 20% of Crane's subjects received these special notations. But it was the next discovery that transformed suspicion into certainty. Sheriff Carter, accompanied by Deputy James Wheeler, visited Michelle Mitchell's grave on February 16th. The child had been buried for 6 months, the first of the Mitchell family to die. If the pattern held, if whatever had been done to Ellen and Gerald had also been done to their daughter, then they were dealing with something far beyond the acceptable boundaries of funeral practice. 9-year-old Michelle lay in her small white coffin as if sleeping. Her blonde hair remained lustrous. Her skin retained the pale, porcelain quality of childhood. The doll she clutched showed no signs of decay, its fabric dress still bright, its painted eyes still gleaming. Most disturbingly, someone had recently been to this grave. The earth around the coffin showed evidence of having been disturbed and carefully replaced within the past few weeks. Footprints in the remaining patches of snow led away from the grave, toward the edge of the cemetery, then disappeared where the ground had been swept clean. Sheriff Carter, stood in that open grave, looking down at a perfectly preserved child, and felt something break inside him. This wasn't science. This wasn't even madness in any form he understood. This was violation on a scale that made him physically ill. The investigation expanded rapidly. On February 17th, operating now with the authorization of the county prosecutor in Helena, whom Carter had contacted by telegram, they began systematic exhumations, not random selections, but deliberate choices based on Crane's records. They focused on individuals who had received those specialized notations, whose bodies had remained in Crane's morgue for extended periods, whose families had commented on their unusual appearance at viewings. They exhumed 7 more bodies over the next 4 days. 5 showed the same impossible preservation. 2 had decomposed normally, suggesting Crane had been selective in his practices. But 5 more cases meant 8 total victims of whatever technique or substance Crane had been using. 8 people whose eternal rest had been corrupted into something unspeakable. The town of Hollow Ridge descended into hysteria. Families demanded their loved ones be exhumed and inspected. Rumors spread that Crane was a necromancer, a devil worshipper, a resurrectionist from the dark pages of Gothic novels. Some claimed to have seen lights in the cemetery at night, heard chanting, witnessed shadowy figures moving among the graves. Whether these accounts predated the discoveries or were retroactive fabrications born of fear, no one could say with certainty. On February 20th, Sheriff Carter and Deputy Wheeler went to arrest Richard Crane. They found his funeral home abandoned. The front door stood unlocked, swinging slightly in the mountain wind. Inside, the building appeared to have been evacuated in haste, but not panic. Crane's personal belongings were gone. His professional equipment remained. And in the basement preparation room they found something that would become central to understanding the full horror of Hollow Ridge. A journal, leather-bound, water-stained, filled with 19 years of meticulous entries written in Crane's precise handwriting. The journal detailed every body he had received, every experiment he had conducted, every formula he had attempted. But more than that, it revealed the why behind the what. Richard Crane wasn't simply preserving bodies. He was attempting to achieve something he called aesthetic immortality, a state in which the dead could remain forever beautiful, forever untouched by decay's degradation, forever available for contemplation and, in his own chilling words, companionship. The implications were monstrous. Crane had been visiting these graves, regularly, secretly, for years. Sheriff Carter sent urgent telegrams to state authorities. Montana's Attorney General dispatched investigators. The U.S. Marshal's Office opened a federal case. And somewhere in the Montana wilderness, Richard Crane had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Before we continue deeper into this investigation, I want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe Richard Crane was working alone? What do you think drove him to these acts? And most importantly, where do you think he went? Your theories matter because, as we'll see, this case has never been fully solved, and fresh perspectives might illuminate corners that investigators in 1923 couldn't see. The journal found in Richard Crane's basement would become one of the most disturbing documents in Montana criminal history. Currently sealed in the Montana State Archives under restricted access, requiring special permission to view, the journal spans 347 pages of densely written text, technical diagrams, and what can only be described as philosophical justifications for the unspeakable. The first entry, dated March 3, 1904, begins innocuously. Arrived in Hollow Ridge today. The town is crude, but the solitude is exactly what I require. Here I can continue my work without the interference I faced in Philadelphia. This single sentence opened a door into Crane's past that investigators immediately pursued. Telegraph inquiries to Philadelphia revealed that Richard Crane had indeed worked as an assistant embalmer at the Laurel Hill Cemetery from 1898 to 1903. Where he had been dismissed under circumstances the cemetery's administration refused to detail even 20 years later. The early journal entries focused on what Crane called the inadequacy of standard preservation methods. He wrote extensively about the Egyptian mummification processes, the Capuchin monks' preservation techniques in Palermo, the experiments of European anatomists who had attempted to arrest decomposition through various chemical means. Crane viewed decay as humanity's greatest enemy, the final insult to human dignity, the transformation of beauty into horror. "Why do we accept," he wrote in an entry from 1905, "that those we love must be consumed by corruption? Why do we surrender our dead to worms and dissolution when science offers the possibility of eternal preservation? The funeral industry pretends to honor the dead while secretly acknowledging that we merely delay the inevitable. I refuse this compromise. I will achieve what others have only dreamed, true preservation, perfect and permanent." But theory without practice remained abstract, and Hollow Ridge provided Crane with what he needed most: subjects and isolation. His first experiment, detailed with clinical precision in the journal, involved a miner named Patrick Donovan who died in a shaft collapse in October 1906. Crane used an experimental embalming formula based on arsenic compounds mixed with glycerin and formaldehyde in proportions he had calculated from his research. The results were promising but imperfect. Donovan's body showed extended preservation for 3 weeks, but eventually began the inevitable decomposition process. Crane was undeterred. He refined his formula. He experimented with injection points, with fluid pressures, with post-embalming treatments. Each body that came through his preparation room became a test subject, though most received standard embalming for comparison purposes. By 1910, he had achieved preservation periods of up to 6 months. By 1915, he believed he had perfected a technique that could maintain a body indefinitely. The journal entries from 1915 onward took on a different tone. The clinical detachment gave way to something more personal, more obsessive. Crane began describing the bodies he preserved in aesthetic terms, noting the grace of their features, the serenity of their expressions, the beauty of their uncorrupted forms. He developed favorites, individuals whose preservation he considered particularly successful, and he began documenting visits to their graves. "Return to Margaret's resting place tonight," reads an entry. From April 1916, "The moon was full, providing adequate light. Used the key I had made to unlock the cemetery gate. Her grave required some excavation, but the earth had not yet fully settled, making the work easier than anticipated. Opened her coffin and confirmed that the preservation remains perfect after 8 months. Sat with her for 2 hours, sketching her features by lantern light. There is something transcendent in this permanence, this victory over nature's cruelty." Margaret Holloway had been a schoolteacher who died of tuberculosis in August 1915. She was 26 years old. The realization of what Crane was describing, what he had been doing in the darkness while Hollow Ridge slept, sent investigators into urgent action. How many graves had he visited? How many coffins had he opened? How many times had he violated the sanctity of death under the guise of aesthetic appreciation? The journal provided partial answers. Crane meticulously documented his nocturnal visits, noting which graves were easiest to access, which families never visited their dead and thus posed no risk of discovery, which bodies had maintained their preservation and which had disappointed him by showing signs of decay despite his best efforts. By conservative count, based on the journal entries, he had exhumed and visited preserved bodies at least 47 times between 1915 and early 1923. but it was the entries concerning the Mitchell family that revealed the full depth of Crane's depravity. When Michelle Mitchell died in August 1922, Crane wrote, "The child is perfect, blonde hair, delicate features, the innocence of youth preserved at its peak. I have applied my most refined formula. She will remain unchanged, a permanent testament to beauty arrested at its most pure moment." 2 weeks later, when Ellen Mitchell died, he wrote, "The mother has joined the daughter. Both now rest in my care, both preserved, both untouched by corruption. There is a poetry in keeping families together in this way, in ensuring that death does not erase their physical presence from the world." And when Gerald Mitchell died, "The Father completes the Trinity. I have taken extra care with this family. They will be my masterwork, proof that my methods have transcended experimental status and achieved reliable perfection. In centuries to come, when my techniques are finally recognized and celebrated, the Mitchell family will stand as evidence of what I accomplished here in isolation, without recognition, without appreciation." What Crane didn't document in his journal, what investigators would discover through other means, was that his midnight visits weren't solely for observation and sketching, but those revelations would come later from evidence found in the most horrifying discovery of all. On February 23, 1923, 3 days after Richard Crane's disappearance, investigators made a discovery that transformed the case from disturbing to nightmarish. Deputy James Wheeler, while searching the funeral home's coal cellar for any overlooked evidence, noticed that the brick wall at the far end produced a hollow sound when struck. Closer inspection revealed mortar that appeared newer than the surrounding masonry. Sheriff Carter authorized demolition of the wall. What lay beyond would be described in official reports with clinical language that barely masked the horror the investigators felt. Behind the false wall, access through a narrow passage, was a chamber approximately 15 feet long and 10 feet wide, carved directly into the bedrock beneath Hollow Ridge. The chamber was reinforced with timber supports, lit by oil lamps mounted on the walls, and furnished in a manner that defied all rational explanation. The room contained a wooden examining table covered with a clean white sheet. Shelves lined one wall, holding dozens of glass bottles containing various chemical compounds, all carefully labeled in Crane's handwriting. Arsenical. Solution, March 1920. Glycerin compound, experimental batch 7, formaldehyde enhancement, double strength. On another wall hung detailed anatomical drawings of the human circulatory system, with notes indicating optimal injection points for preservation fluids. But it was the room's other furnishings that revealed its true purpose. Against the far wall stood a remarkably well-preserved Victorian settee, upholstered in dark velvet. Beside it, a small table held a book of poetry by Edgar Allan Poe, open to Annabel Lee. A phonograph rested on a wooden stand, its horn polished to a dull gleam. Several photographic portraits, all of deceased individuals Crane had prepared, hung in ornate frames. This was not a laboratory. This was a parlor, a receiving room, a place designed for extended visits with the dead. The state investigators who arrived from Helena documented everything with growing disbelief. Dr. Edmund Walsh, a forensic pathologist brought in from the state medical examiner's office, examined the chamber with particular attention to the examining table. His report, filed on March 2, 1923, noted the presence of hair samples, fabric fibers, and trace amounts of embalming fluid. More disturbingly, he found evidence that the table had been used recently and repeatedly, with wear patterns suggesting frequent occupation. But the chamber held more secrets. In a locked wooden chest beneath the examining table, investigators found photographs. Not the formal, post-mortem portraits that were common in the era, but candid images taken in this very room. Photographs of bodies positioned on the settee as if resting, Photographs of Crane himself, seated beside preserved corpses in poses suggesting companionship. Photographs of the Mitchell family, taken at different times, showing all three bodies arranged together as if they were merely sleeping in a family portrait. The photographs numbered 63 in total. Each was dated on the reverse in Crane's handwriting. The earliest dated from 1912. The most recent was from February 10th, 1923, just 4 days before Anthony Brennan's discovery. It showed Ellen Mitchell, positioned on the settee, a blanket draped across her lap, her preserved features serene in the lamplight. Dr. Walsh's report included a section that the state prosecutor initially considered suppressing, but ultimately allowed to stand as evidence of the investigation's thoroughness. Analysis of several photographs revealed that the bodies had been repositioned multiple times, dressed in different clothing, arranged in various poses. The clothing, found folded neatly in another chest, included items that had not been buried with the deceased. Crane had apparently been maintaining a wardrobe for his preserved subjects, changing their outfits as one might dress dolls. The psychological implications were staggering. Richard Crane had not merely been preserving bodies for scientific study or even for aesthetic contemplation. He had been creating companions, populating his underground parlor with the preserved dead, staging elaborate tableaus, spending hours or perhaps entire nights in this chamber beneath his funeral home, surrounded by those who could neither consent nor refuse his attentions. Father O'Brien, called upon to bless and sanctify the chamber once the investigation concluded, later wrote to the Bishop of Helena, "I have seen evil take physical form. That room beneath Hollow Ridge represents a corruption of the soul so profound that I questioned whether absolution is even possible for such transgressions. The man who created that space had severed all connection with human decency, with divine law, with the basic respect owed to the departed." But the chamber revealed one more secret, perhaps the most chilling of all. On the wall opposite the settee, someone had carved words directly into the stone. The carving was crude but legible, and the message was dated February 14th, 1923, the day Anthony Brennan made his discovery. "They have found my work. They will destroy what I have built, but I have preserved what matters most. Where I go, beauty goes with me. The dead are more faithful than the living. They never judge, never abandon, never decay if properly maintained. I take with me proof of my achievement. Let them search. They will not find what I have taken." The implications of that message sent investigators into a frantic new phase of the investigation. If Crane had taken something, with him, if he had removed evidence, or worse, if he had taken one or more of the bodies he had preserved, then he remained an active threat, carrying his depravity into the wider world. The manhunt for Richard Crane became one of the most extensive searches in Montana history. The U.S. Marshal's Office coordinated with local sheriffs across 5 states. His photograph, taken from a church directory, appeared in newspapers from Seattle to Denver. Wanted posters described him as extremely dangerous, possibly in possession of human remains. Approach with caution. But Montana in 1923 offered 1,000 places for a man to disappear. The wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, broken only by occasional settlements connected by primitive roads that winter made impassable. Abandoned mine shafts riddled the mountains, offering countless hiding places. And if Crane had prepared for his flight, if he had cached supplies in advance, he could survive indefinitely in isolation. The search focused initially on the most logical assumption, that Crane had fled immediately after learning of the grave discovery, probably on the evening of February 14th or early morning of February 15th. But investigation of his movements revealed something more calculated. Witnesses came forward reporting that Crane had been seen at the general store on February 13th, purchasing an unusually large amount of supplies, tinned goods, lamp oil, rope, canvas sheeting. The store owner, Mr. Howard Pierce, remembered thinking it odd but not alarming. Winter in Hollow Ridge meant everyone kept emergency supplies. More disturbing was the testimony of Martha Hendricks, a widow who lived 3 houses down from the funeral home. She reported seeing light in the funeral home's windows late on the night of February 14th, well after news of Ellen Mitchell's preserved body had spread through town. The light came from the basement, she said, and she saw Crane's shadow moving back and forth for hours, carrying what appeared to be a heavy burden. The obvious question became, which body had Crane taken? Investigators conducted a grim inventory of every grave in Hollow Ridge Cemetery that Crane had noted in his journal as containing preserved remains. Most were undisturbed except for the official exhumations. But 3 graves showed signs of recent, unauthorized excavation that predated the official investigation. The graves of Michelle Mitchell, a young woman named Catherine Ross, who had died in 1918, and an elderly man named Thomas Whitmore, who had passed in 1920, all had disturbed earth that careful analysis suggested had been dug and refilled within days of February 14th. Further examination revealed that only one coffin had been removed entirely, Michelle Mitchell's. Her small white coffin was gone, excavated with considerable effort given the frozen ground, the grave then carefully refilled to avoid immediate detection. The 9-year-old child's body, preserved, in defiance of nature by Crane's chemicals, had been stolen by the man who created that preservation. The horror of this realization paralyzed the investigation for a crucial day. Crane had disappeared into the Montana wilderness carrying the corpse of a child. The psychological implications were so disturbing that even hardened law enforcement officers struggled to maintain professional detachment. Dr. Walsh submitted a supplementary report stating, "We are dealing with a level of psychopathology without precedent in my experience. This individual has demonstrated not merely disrespect for the dead, but an obsessive attachment that transcends any known psychiatric category." Search parties scoured the mountains throughout March and April 1923. They found abandoned campsites, evidence of someone traveling north toward the Canadian border. They found a cave 30 miles from Hollow Ridge containing embalming equipment identical to what Crane had used. They found nothing resembling a body, living or dead. By May, when the mountain snows finally melted enough for comprehensive searching, the trail had gone completely cold. Richard Crane had vanished as thoroughly as if he had never existed, and somewhere in the vast wilderness, Michelle Mitchell's preserved body remained missing, taken God knows where, for God knows what purpose. The psychological impact on Hollow Ridge was catastrophic. Families who had buried loved ones in what they believed was sacred ground now understood that those graves had been violated repeatedly, that their dead had been used as subjects in experiments, as companions in midnight vigils, as objects in a twisted gallery of arrested decay. The cemetery was deconsecrated by the church and eventually abandoned. By 1925, as mentioned earlier, most of the town's residents had fled, unable to live with the knowledge of what had happened beneath their feet while they slept. The mine closed that same year, not for economic reasons, but because workers refused to continue. Superstition spread that the ground itself was cursed, that the dead of Hollow Ridge would never rest peacefully. The few who remained eventually scattered to surrounding communities, carrying their trauma with them, rarely speaking of what they had witnessed. The funeral home was burned to the ground by person or persons unknown in August 1924. The underground chamber was sealed with concrete by county order. The entire town of Hollow Ridge gradually succumbed to abandonment, its buildings collapsing under winter snows, its streets reclaimed by wilderness, until nothing remained but foundations and memories too dark to speak aloud. For decades, the story of Hollow Ridge existed only in sealed court documents, in whispered warnings passed between Montana old-timers, in the private nightmares of those few survivors who had witnessed the investigations firsthand. The official files remained classified under a state order citing public morality concerns, but history has a way of refusing burial, and in the decades following 1923, fragments of the story continued to surface, each revelation adding new layers to an already incomprehensible horror. The first significant discovery came in June 1954, 31 years after Richard Crane's disappearance. A geology professor from the University of Montana, Dr. Robert Kemper, was conducting a mineral survey in the Bitterroot Range when he stumbled upon the ruins of Hollow Ridge. Most of the town had collapsed or been consumed by forest regrowth, but the cemetery remained partially visible, its iron gates rusted but standing, its headstones tilted like broken teeth against the mountain sky. Dr. Kemper, unaware of the town's history, began documenting the site for a paper on abandoned settlements. While photographing the cemetery, he noticed something unusual. Several graves showed signs of relatively recent disturbance. Not fresh excavation, but evidence that within the past few years, someone had been digging in the old cemetery. Curiosity led him to report this to the county sheriff's office in Helena, triggering the first official return to Hollow Ridge since the 1920s. The investigation revealed that at least 6 graves had been partially excavated, the coffins opened and then resealed. Nothing appeared to have been taken. Instead, items had been left behind. In one grave, investigators found a newer leather notebook, protected from the elements by oilcloth wrapping. The notebook contained entries dated from 1949 to 1953, written in handwriting that forensic analysis later confirmed matched Richard Crane's distinctive script from the 1923 journal. The entries were fragmentary, water-damaged in places, but what remained was chilling. "Returned after 26 years," read one passage from 1949. "The town is gone, but the graves remain. My subjects have finally achieved what I always intended. They have outlasted everything. While Hollow Ridge crumbled, they endured. I have proven my theory beyond question." Another entry, dated 1951. "She is still with me. All these years, perfect and unchanged, I have maintained her as promised. We have traveled far together, seen things the living can only dream of. This is what I tried to tell them. Death need not be the end of companionship. Properly preserved, properly honored, the dead can accompany us through time itself." The implications were staggering. Richard Crane had not only survived nearly 3 decades in hiding, but he had kept Michelle Mitchell's body with him throughout those years, maintaining his preservation techniques, treating the corpse of a 9-year-old child as a companion. The psychological grotesqueness of this revelation prompted the FBI to join the investigation, though by 1954, Crane would have been 82 years old if still alive. The notebook contained one final entry, dated February 1953, exactly 30 years after his flight from Hollow Ridge. I'm old now. My hands shake. The formulas require precision I can no longer guarantee. Soon I will join them, and who will maintain us then? I have prepared a place where we can rest together, where no one will disturb what I have achieved. Let this notebook serve as proof that I succeeded where others only theorized. I conquered decay. I preserved beauty. I loved more faithfully than any living man could. Despite extensive searching, investigators never found Crane's body or Michelle Mitchell's remains. The notebook offered no clues to their final resting place. The FBI investigation continued sporadically until 1960, when it was officially closed due to the presumed death of the suspect. But the story didn't end there. In 1967, a local historian named Margaret Thorne began researching Montana mining towns for a book project. While interviewing elderly residents in Helena, she encountered an 83-year-old woman named Dorothy Brennan, daughter of Anthony Brennan, the gravedigger, who had made the initial discovery in 1923. Dorothy had been 17 years old during the Hollow Ridge events, and she had been sworn to silence by her father, who feared for her safety if she spoke about what the family knew. Now, in the final years of her life, Dorothy decided the truth deserved recording. She revealed that her father had discovered something in 1923 that he never reported to authorities, something that terrified him so deeply he made his family swear never to speak of it. 2 weeks before the official discovery of Ellen Mitchell's preserved body, Anthony Brennan had noticed fresh footprints in the cemetery snow leading to several graves. Following them, he witnessed Richard Crane exhuming a coffin in the dead of night. "Father watched from behind a monument," Dorothy told Margaret Thorne in a recorded interview now preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives. "He saw Mr. Crane open the coffin, saw him talking to whoever was inside, saw him touch the body's face with such tenderness it made my father sick. He wanted to confront him right then, but he was afraid. Mr. Crane had always been strange, and seeing him there in the moonlight, whispering to a corpse, Father said he looked like something that had crawled up from hell itself." Anthony Brennan had deliberately damaged Ellen Mitchell's grave 2 days later, Dorothy revealed, creating the frost heave that necessitated excavation. He did this to force official discovery of what he suspected but couldn't prove alone. His plan worked, but the guilt of waiting those 2 weeks, of leaving other bodies vulnerable to Crane's nocturnal visits, haunted him until his death. Margaret Thorne's research uncovered other belated testimonies. She found hospital records from a sanatorium in Seattle showing that a patient matching Richard Crane's description had been briefly admitted in 1939 under the name Richard Kane for treatment of severe frostbite. The attending physician's notes mentioned that the patient traveled with unusual baggage he refused to be separated from, claiming it contained scientific specimens of great personal value. The patient had checked himself out against medical advice after 3 days and disappeared. In 1972, construction workers expanding a logging road 90 miles north of Hollow Ridge discovered a small cave containing what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory. Glass bottles with chemical residue lined crude shelves. A leather medical bag contained embalming instruments, and carved into the cave wall was a message: "Beauty is eternal, love is faithful, death is defeated." R.C. 1941. The most disturbing discovery came in 1978. A Forest Service employee conducting a survey in an extremely remote section of the Bitterroot Range, accessible only by helicopter, found a clearing containing 2 graves. Both were marked with simple wooden crosses, weathered but still standing. One cross bore the name Michelle Grace Mitchell, 1913-1922, forever young. The other read, Richard Crane, 1872-1956, guardian of beauty. The graves were excavated under court order. Richard Crane's remains were found, naturally decomposed, confirming he had survived until age 84. But Michelle's grave was empty. The coffin was there, carefully constructed, lined with silk, but no body occupied it. Whether Crane had never actually buried her, whether someone had since removed her remains, or whether some other explanation existed, no one could determine. The empty grave became the final, unanswerable question in the Hollow Ridge case. Had Crane finally buried Michelle, and someone later disturbed the grave? Had he buried something else entirely, maintaining the fiction of burial while keeping her preserved body elsewhere? Had he achieved some form of preservation so complete that no trace remained even of the preserved tissue? These fragmentary discoveries across 5 decades painted a picture of a man who spent 33 years in hiding, wandering the Montana wilderness, maintaining his obsessive relationship with a dead child, convinced he had achieved something worthy of scientific recognition rather than moral condemnation. Each new piece of evidence added horror without providing clarity, questions without answers, glimpses into an abyss that seemed to deepen rather than resolve with time. The case of Hollow Ridge and Richard Crane remains to this day one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in American history. Despite decades of investigation, despite fragmentary discoveries that continued into the late 20th century, despite the testimony of survivors and the evidence contained in Crane's own journals, fundamental questions remain unanswered. What truly drove Richard Crane to his obsessive violations? What happened to Michelle Mitchell's body? And perhaps most unsettling, did Crane's preservation techniques actually work as well as he claimed? Several theories have emerged over the years, each attempting to explain the inexplicable, to impose rational order on events that seem to defy human understanding. The first theory, favored by most historians and psychologists who have studied the case, is that Richard Crane was a deeply disturbed individual, suffering from what modern psychiatry would likely classify as a severe necrophilic disorder, combined with delusional beliefs about his own scientific achievements. According to this interpretation, his preservation techniques, while perhaps more effective than standard embalming, were not the miraculous breakthroughs he believed them to be. The bodies that remained perfectly preserved for months may have been kept in controlled conditions in his underground chamber, regularly treated with fresh chemicals, maintained through constant intervention rather than through any permanent transformation. When Crane fled with Michelle Mitchell's body, this theory suggests, he spent the remaining 33 years of his life in isolated locations, continuously applying his preservation formulas, convinced he was demonstrating scientific genius rather than engaging in profound violation. The second theory is darker and more disturbing. Some investigators, particularly those who examined the chemical formulas detailed in Crane's journals, believe he may have actually achieved something unprecedented in preservation science. The arsenic-based compounds he developed, combined with his injection techniques and post-treatment methods, may have created a state of preservation that genuinely arrested decomposition in ways that standard embalming could not. If this theory is correct, then the bodies he treated in Hollow Ridge may have remained preserved for decades or even longer, and Michelle Mitchell's body, subjected to Crane's most refined techniques and maintained by him for over 30 years, could theoretically still exist somewhere in a state of arrested decay. This theory raises horrifying questions about what should be done if her remains are ever discovered, and whether Crane's techniques, stripped of their grotesque application, might have legitimate scientific value. The third theory, whispered among those who grew up hearing the Hollow Ridge story, is that something supernatural occurred in that isolated Montana cemetery. They point to the numerous accounts of strange lights, to the testimonies of unease and dread that survivors reported feeling in the town, to the seemingly impossible preservation that exceeded any known scientific explanation. This theory suggests that Crane, through his obsessive experiments and repeated violations of the dead, somehow crossed a threshold into something beyond natural law, that his underground chamber became a place where the boundary between life and death grew dangerously thin. Proponents of this theory note that Hollow Ridge was built on land that indigenous peoples had long considered cursed, that the mine itself had been the site of unusually frequent fatal accidents, that the entire town seemed to attract tragedy in disproportionate measure. But regardless of which theory one accepts, certain facts remain undeniable. Richard Crane violated the graves and remains of at least 8 individuals, possibly many more. He created an underground chamber where he conducted midnight vigils with corpses he had preserved. He fled into the wilderness carrying the body of a 9-year-old child and kept that body with him for over 3 decades. And somewhere in the vast Montana wilderness, Michelle Grace Mitchell's final resting place remains unknown, her body's fate a mystery that may never be solved. The ruins of Hollow Ridge still exist, though they are remote and difficult to access. The cemetery, long since reclaimed by forest, occasionally draws curious researchers and dark tourism enthusiasts, though local authorities discourage visits. The underground chamber beneath, where the funeral home once stood, remains. Sealed with concrete, a tomb for secrets that society chose to bury rather than fully confront. To this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened in Hollow Ridge. No one knows what drove Richard Crane beyond the obvious explanations of mental illness and criminal depravity. No one knows if his preservation techniques represented genuine scientific achievement, twisted to monstrous purposes, or merely the delusions of a diseased mind. And no one knows where Michelle Mitchell finally came to rest, or in what condition her remains might be if ever discovered. Some mysteries, perhaps, are meant to remain unsolved. Some questions disturb us more in their asking than any answer could resolve. The story of Hollow Ridge stands as a reminder that human darkness can exceed our capacity to fully comprehend it, that evil can wear the mask of science, and obsession can disguise itself as devotion. Before we close this investigation, I want to hear from you, the members of our haunted community. What do you believe really happened in Hollow Ridge? Do you think Michelle Mitchell's body still exists somewhere, preserved by Crane's chemicals? Do you believe there was something supernatural at work, or merely human madness taken to its darkest extreme? Share your theories in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell to join us on future journeys into the forgotten corners of history, where darkness lingers and truth remains elusive. Thank you for accompanying me on this investigation. Until our next descent into the shadows, remember that history's darkest chapters are often those we tried hardest to forget. But forgetting doesn't erase the past. It only allows it to haunt us more effectively. Stay curious, stay questioning. And perhaps, late at night when sleep eludes you, spare a thought for the abandoned graves of Hollow Ridge, and for a little girl whose rest was stolen by a man who confused preservation with love, who mistook violation for devotion, who believed he could defeat death when all he really achieved was corrupting it beyond recognition. Until next time.